Thank you to Boksu for sponsoring today's video. Stay tuned to the end of the video to see a fun snack tasting test and a special offer just for you. Hello witches and warlocks, I hope that you're all doing well. If you saw last week's video, you'll know that I had given a little hint to who was going to be featured in today's video, and that hint was that the character had magical powers and a furry companion. And of course, so many of you guessed correctly that it was Kiki and Gigi from one of my favorite Studio Ghibli films, Kiki's Delivery Service. To be fair, I purposely chose a description that would fit multiple different characters to try and throw some of you guys off. And there was definitely some great guesses, such as Sailor Moon with Luna, Sakura with Karo, and Sabrina with Salem, who are all characters that I enjoy quite a lot. I'm not gonna lie, Sabrina the Teenage Witch was definitely something that I loved growing up in the 90s, and I really did debate on including her instead of Kiki, but I just have this very, very special place in my heart for Kiki's Delivery Service. If you guys have seen my screen cap redraw of Kiki, you'll probably know that quite extensively already. But yeah, so for today's illustration, I decided to finally use my Winsor & Newton gouache, which I had been neglecting for quite some time since I was so preoccupied with trying out so many other brands that I own. The Winsor & Newton gouache, though, is actually the first gouache that I've ever owned or even had any experience with, since it was what was included in my school art kit when I went to college for a one-year art fundamentals course, and it was also required in my first year at college in graphic design as well. Interestingly enough, though, during both of those years of school, I was never taught how to use gouache in the way that I use it now. My teachers had taught me how to use gouache in a much more graphic and minimal style, which made sense since the general purpose of gouache for a very long time was that it was used for posters way back in the day. And so instead of trying to blend and do all these layering and shading and all these kinds of things that I currently use it for, I feel like, back then it was just meant to be flat, solid shapes and colors, which definitely has a large appeal as well. But for me, I just really enjoy rendering with gouache because I kind of like this juxtaposition of how flat and matte it is, but then also being able to render with it as well. But yeah, so since my days at school, I just experimented with gouache over the years and slowly adapted to being able to use it in a more kind of detailed way. And I actually still have a bunch of the old tubes of gouache paint still from my very first year at graphic design, which was actually quite a number of years ago now, and they are surprisingly still good. A little bit on the dry side, I did have a little bit of trouble opening some of the lids, but they are still totally usable since they are water soluble after all. Just so long as, I'm able to squeeze the paint out of the tube, then they're totally reworkable with some water. So to begin, I want to be totally honest here and say that I actually felt completely lost for the majority of this painting process. I get so many questions from you guys about gouache, and even though I've used the medium quite a number of times, I still find it to be very, very challenging to use, and I end up in situations like this illustration where I'm just sort of meanderingly painting and I'm kind of stressed out because I don't know where it's going and I feel like it's just going to be a piece of hot garbage. But thankfully I stuck it out, and as you would have seen at the beginning of the video, I managed to pull it off. But yeah, doing this illustration just kind of reminded me of why I don't do tutorials, and I've said this multiple times because the reason why I don't do tutorials, or that I, am hesitant to do them, is because I don't typically have a linear path. I don't have a linear process. And so if I were to try and do a tutorial on this illustration, it would just lead everyone astray for a couple of hours and it wouldn't really be very helpful. I mean, I'm going to definitely talk about the process of this piece, which might be insightful for you guys. But again, this illustration would not have made a good tutorial because I did a lot of unnecessary steps that I think I could have avoided had I had a better plan in mind. Anyways, I think I had a particularly hard time getting into the groove of this particular painting session was due to a few reasons. One, I didn't plan out my colors in advance as thoroughly as I normally would for an elaborate illustration like this. And number two, I was kind of rushing myself at the beginning because I really wanted to meet a certain deadline. And then thirdly, I had been painting with watercolors the past little while, so I think trying to rewire my brain for gouache took me a moment because painting with each of those mediums is very different. And lastly, I hadn't done an illustration with a full background like this in a while either, so it was kind of intimidating. Anyways, as you would have seen in the beginning of this illustration process, I initially went in with very vibrant colors and basically tried to use the gouache in the same way I would use watercolors. One of the problems with that though is that when you dilute gouache with enough water, while it does become quite transparent, which is similar to watercolors, unfortunately, I find it doesn't move and flow on the paper in the same way that watercolor does. I found that with gouache, it kind of just stays put for the most part, whereas when you use wet on wet techniques with watercolors, they blend and bleed into one another, which makes for some really nice soft gradients and color shifts. I believe it was around this point in the illustration where I figured I might as well keep making really bold color choices and hope that I can see some promising results, or otherwise I was going to scrap this and start all over again, which of course I definitely wanted to avoid since I had already spent enough time working on this piece in the first place. And I'm the type of person who hates starting things over. I'd rather just try and see something through so I don't have to do it again. And so I figured that by putting in some of the darkest tones in the piece, that would help give me some perspective on how bold the other colors were really looking and how I was going to balance the contrast between all the different elements. Because I find that sometimes colors look super saturated when everything is fairly light and diluted so having these dark tones helps the other colors not feel so loud. Of course, as we're looking at this piece right now, it's still very loud, but this is my train of thought. And so I also finally reminded myself of the obvious, which was that I was using gouache, which is an opaque medium, so I might as well actually use it in an opaque fashion as opposed to trying to use it like a watercolor. And so I felt like this definitely helped me feel a little bit more optimistic about continuing on with this piece, since I knew that if I didn't like something, I could always just cover it up with more paint. And so adding in all the cool tones for the clouds and just getting rid of that bright yellow shine on the clouds altogether, I think really helped make the piece feel less chaotic, because I think having that bright yellow on the clouds really felt so busy, and it really didn't need to be, since obviously we want the eyes to be looking at Kiki and Gigi. And so I feel like having kind of blocked out that yellow, it really helped make the piece feel more harmonious, even though I knew that it was not anywhere near being done. But it did give me some hope that I might actually be able to make this into something that I would relatively like. And so, of course, deciding to exclude the bright yellow highlight on pretty much the rest of the illustration definitely, helped move the painting along as well. And yeah, I just felt like it was really, really distracting. And so at this point, I was able to focus on having a more clear direction, which was that I wanted the overall piece to have a very purple and pink color palette, which definitely suits Kiki because, she wears a dark purple dress, and while her bow is technically red, I had it lean, kind of a red pink. And then in the movie, she expresses, an admiration for these red shoes in the store window. And so, of course, I gave her some red shoes in this illustration to kind of have a nod to that part of the movie. Weirdly enough, I think the turning point for me with the process of this illustration was when I finished painting this rooftop. Up until this point, I was kind of dragging my feet with this illustration since it started out so stressful, and then I spent so long just aimlessly trying to figure out what direction this piece was going to go in. But thankfully, by the time I started adding in the kind of magenta tones and the purple shadows on that rooftop, that was when I felt like I was kind of finding my groove with the illustration, and I was actually really starting to enjoy the painting process, which up until that point I wasn't really, which is kind of weird when you think about how, we as artists, we express such a love and passion for illustration and painting. And while, of course, I am very passionate and I do love drawing and painting, but unfortunately, sometimes it's just not always easy breezy, which brings me to a good topic that I constantly get questions about, whether or not there are some kind of tips and tricks about staying motivated or how I avoid being discouraged from a bad painting experience. And while I've definitely touched upon this topic before, the short answer is that you really have to push yourself. Of course, this is definitely easier said than done, but it's true. I wanted to give up on this illustration multiple times, but I forced myself to keep painting and keep experimenting, and thankfully it ended up working out in the end. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because when you see the process, it's all sped up, it's edited, and it just makes it look so much easier than it actually was. And every paint stroke, every decision looks like it's very intentional and confident, when sometimes it really is not the case. And I think that's probably the same for many artists who show their process of their illustrations. And so I just thought that it was really important to be transparent about that and let you guys know that everyone experiences those ups and downs during a painting, and you're really not alone in feeling discouraged or wanting to give up on something because it's just not turning out the way that you want it to. And yeah, you just can't see that based on a video or a post you see on Instagram, because what you're being presented seems like it came naturally or that it was super easy. And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk about that because I know I've definitely, especially during this particular illustration, I was like, this is horrible. I think I forget how to paint. So yeah, it's one of those things where in the moment it's really difficult, but once you come out the other side, it all works out in the end, which is very nice. Obviously, it doesn't always end up working out. There's definitely going to be cases where you spend tons of time on an illustration and then in the end it's still not exactly what you wanted it to be. But ultimately, you have learned a lot in that time that you were painting. And so it's still going to be worth the time. And I do think that it's really valuable to try and finish your illustrations as opposed to giving up on them. And so, yeah, which is why I'm very glad I didn't give up on this illustration, because in the end, I end up really liking how she turned out. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Kiki's Delivery Service is a movie that is very near and dear to my heart. For those of you who have seen my older video where I recreated a screenshot from the film, you'll already have heard me ramble quite a bit about how much I love this movie. I'm pretty sure Kiki is what sparked my love of witches and overall magical themes in general, and of course that is something that I absolutely adore to this day. Of course, like many others, Studio Ghibli films in general are something that I grew up with and have enjoyed all throughout my adulthood as well. They are hugely inspirational, and I actually own a few of the art books from a few of the films that contain storyboards and concept sketches and just more overall behind the scenes content. I currently own the art books for Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, and Howl's Moving Castle. Miyazaki's concept sketches are so energetic and full of life. I really envy how loose and yet very detailed his watercolor sketches are. And then all of the hand-painted backgrounds from the films are also basically works of art on their own. I believe that they're all painted with gouache, and it's such a treat to be able to look at them without the animated characters on top, since you really get to appreciate them in a new way and notice things that you wouldn't have otherwise during the film. And so, as some of you may know, Netflix had added most of, if not all, of the Studio Ghibli films. And while I have already seen most of these movies to begin with, there were a few left over that I still hadn't seen yet. And so the two that I had watched recently that I'd never seen before were Porco Rosso and The Wind Rises, which are both directed by Miyazaki, and incidentally both heavily focus on flying. I mean, pretty much every single Miyazaki film will feature flying in it at some point, but these ones are, flying is kind of the main focal point. Porco Rosso I absolutely loved. It was such a fun, charming, and overall very entertaining film. I loved how energetic all the characters were. I loved how spunky the female lead was. I genuinely laughed out loud at so many different scenes. It was just a very, very fun movie, and I will definitely be watching it again at some point. The Wind Rises, I thought, was definitely a beautiful film, and admittedly, I did cry while watching it. But overall, it just didn't capture me the same way that most Miyazaki films normally do. I think that the main element being is that there's no themes of fantasy, whimsy, or any kind of magic. Of course, there are definitely some cinematic moments and scenes, especially like with the dream sequences, but overall, the film felt like, it could have easily been a live action movie, similar to how in the film Rocketman, they did kind of cinematic moments throughout the movie. Which, by the way, I really enjoyed Rocketman. It was a really, really fun film. Anyways, so of course there's nothing wrong with having a more serious animated film, but I think for me what makes animated stories so much more compelling is when they use the medium to their advantage in a way that would be fairly difficult to pull off if it were live action, like with a flying pig in Porco Rosso or a girl riding a giant wolf like in Princess Mononoke. So I think that's the reason why maybe Porco Rosso stood out to me more than The Wind Rises does, because Porco Rosso felt a little bit more from what I expect from Miyazaki film or an animated film, Studio Ghibli film, whereas The Wind Rises is just definitely a much more kind of subdued, quiet, mundane film in a way. But of course, this is just my personal taste. I'm sure there are tons of you guys that absolutely love The Wind Rises, and overall it was a very beautiful film and I still really enjoyed it. But just comparatively to other Miyazaki films that I have been obsessed with over the years, this one just didn't hit me the same way that Kiki or Spirited Away does. And now we are finally reaching to the kind of last leg of the illustration process here. And I cannot tell you how annoyed I was with myself when I decided to repaint the sky again. I don't even know how many times I've painted that sky, but for me, I was feeling as though it was too dark, which kind of seems silly when you think about a night sky. You would think that going dark makes the most sense, but because the overall piece was so pastel, the background sky just felt like it was too stark against these pastel cotton candy kind of clouds. And so I ended up making the last minute decision to lighten up the night sky, and I'm actually really, really glad that I did, because I think that it just feels so much more harmonious with the rest of the piece. And then I think that adding in these little twinkly stars with the paint marker really, really brought it all together. And that's the finished piece. Stay tuned if you want to see me and my friend Elise eat some fun Japanese snacks, and then wait until the very end of the video if you want to hear the clue for which character I'll be doing in next week's Halloween illustration. Boxu is a monthly snack box subscription that delivers original and premium Japanese snacks to your doorstep every month. So I brought my friend in Elise to help me try out some of the snacks for you guys so that you guys could get a feel for what they're like.
Situation. I'm thinking it's more like a cream cheese.
Oh, it's like,
it's
a,
like
little
a little sandwich.
Oh,
Like a little cream cheese sandwich.
Oh, cute.
Oh, do you think this would be like cheesecake?
it smells
Do you smell
good. Ooh, that's nice.
Uh-oh.
It does make me think of spring. But this one has the adorable Kumamon on the packaging. And this I really enjoy because kind of, again, it's like very lightly sweet. Like this one kind of teeters on sweet and savory, I feel like.
Would you say this was a healthy snack?
Yeah, it does kind of give me that vibe. I don't actually know if it's considered a healthy snack.
Sesame seeds.
So, you know.
It's good for you.
I really like that the box has both sweet and savory, especially for this like taste test. It kind of helps to have both, so we're not like overloaded with one or the other. And I'm very excited to try the rest of these treats, but I figured I didn't want to eat them all in one sitting because I feel like you want to enjoy them over time. We ate like half the box, but
yeah, I think I would have eaten everything by now. You know?
And on that note, if you're interested in getting your own treat box, you can check out the link in my description to receive 10% off and save up to $44. Also, did I mention that the shipping is free? So if you're like me and am itching to go traveling, this might be the next best thing to experience Japan right from your home. Hello, friends. Are we digging my Halloween aesthetic today? I love having any and all excuses to wear dramatic makeup, especially black lipstick. Dark lipstick is something that is a little bit harder to get away with on your daily basis. And so now that we are in Halloween month, it felt very appropriate. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Did you guess this week's character correctly last time? So as some of you might already know, I have decided to create Halloween themed illustrations every week for the month of October because it's my favorite month. And so at the end of every video, I'm going to give you guys a clue as to who the character is going to be for the following week. And so my clue for the next week's character is that you could say that this character has two mothers. So I hope that you guys have fun guessing who the character might be in the comments down below. Let me know who you hope it's going to be. And I will see you next week. Bye.